All right, we're at 10 o'clock. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Northern Forest Bird Network webinar series. Today, I'm so excited. We have our second presentation with NIACS. They are going to be talking about assisted migration, a very interesting climate change topic that I came across at the Chippewa National Forest. So I'm really excited to hear what they have to say today. We have Katie Frerker and Maddy Baroli again with us today. Thank you so much for your time. Katie is a climate adaptation specialist with USDA Forest Service and the NIACS group. In her current role, she provides technical advice and assistance in a wide range of forest adaptation and carbon management activities, with an emphasis on national forest units within the Forest Service's eastern region. And then Maddie is also a climate adaptation specialist, and she works for Michigan Tech University. Her focus areas are in forest ecology and management, urban and community forestry, and tree planting and assisted migration. Thank you so much, Maddie and Katie, for being with us today. And we're really excited to hear what you got for assisted migration.
Great. Thank you for having us. I'm going to get going first, and then Maddie and I are just going to kind of tag team the presentation for you all, and we'll leave plenty of time for discussion, hopefully as well, hoping that you might have some questions. So thanks for having us. Maddie, I'm going to prompt you to switch the slides if you want to advance to the next slide. As Jamie mentioned, Maddie and I both work for the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and I know Maddie and Stephen gave a previous webinar, so hopefully you all are familiar with this, but this is a partnership that is led by the Forest Service, but you can see all the partners that we have on the screen. There's university, there's tribal organizations, private industry, so we are not, although I'm a Forest Service employee and it's Forest Service led, it is not specific to Forest Service. We offer technical assistance to all varieties of landowners in the eastern region, the Forest Service eastern region. And so that footprint is the 3Ms, Minnesota down to Missouri and over to Maine. And we like to refer to ourselves as the climate change help desk for this area. Next slide, Maddie, what we want to talk to you about today. And I know that, again, Maddie and Stephen were here a few weeks ago talking about some of these concepts of climate adaptation. And I just want to reiterate a couple points that you may have learned in the previous workshop, particularly if you weren't there. So climate adaptation is the adjustment of systems in preparation or in response to climate change. And something we really like to emphasize when we talk about this is the actions that you take. Adaptation actions are designed to intentionally address climate change impacts and vulnerabilities in order to meet your goals and objectives. So it means that, some of our actions might be similar to what we've been doing all along, but really what we're trying to do is understand how our ecosystems, how our resources are vulnerable, how they're being impacted, and adjust our management decisions where we can, understanding those risks that we have on the landscape. Next slide, Maddie. And when we talk about adaptation actions you can take, there's a spectrum of actions. And I know that last series, Maddie and Stephen, they handed out some menus that kind of display different adaptation options you can take, and they're aligned on this spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum, we have resistance, which is you're really trying to put up defenses against climate change. You're trying to maintain relatively unchanged conditions on the landscape. So an example of that might be like creating climate refugia for species of interest on the landscape. Resilience is a tactic that a lot of us are really comfortable with, and it means that you're accommodating some degree of change. But if a large disturbance event happens, you generally want it to return to some recognizable condition, a similar condition on the landscape. So oftentimes resilience tactics are things like introducing more species diversity into your system, or more structure in the different age classes. So kind of getting away from monocultures and plantations on the landscape is an example of a resilience tactic. And then the final end of the spectrum is a transition tactic. And this is where you're intentionally facilitating change on the landscape and in hopes that the ecosystem will be better prepared to respond to climate change effects on the landscape. So you're intentionally facilitating some kind of change on the landscape. And this transition tactic is the tactic we're going to focus on today, because assisted migration is a topic of a lot of interest we've been hearing, and it is a transition tactic. So next slide, Maddie. Assisted migration. I'm going to put a definition up here so that we're all on the same page. So it's the human assisted movement of species, populations, or genotypes to areas that are outside their historical distribution. And the reason it's done is to maintain biological diversity or ecosystem function in response to climate change. So this is the human assisted movement of species in response to climate change, species, genotypes, or populations. And I really want to emphasize, we just talked about that spectrum of resistance, resilience, transition. Assisted migration is one tool in the toolbox. It's a transition tactic. It's one tactic that you may take on the landscape. But what's important to consider when you're thinking about climate adaptation is you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, or, just rely on one end of that spectrum too heavily. It's best to always do a suite of tools, choose from a variety of tactics along that spectrum, and not just invest in one strategy. So assisted migration is one tool in the toolbox, and we're just going to talk about it today because it's a more complicated one. But assisted migration, so I just gave you that general definition, but really the definition is more nuanced than that, and we can break assisted migration down into three different parts. Three different categories. So the first category, and they each have their own level of risk associated with them. So the first type of assisted migration is assisted population migration. And this is where you take seed sources or populations to new locations within their established range of the species. So you're taking seed from a species on the landscape from further south within its range, and you're moving that seed north, still within the same species range. And I want to give specific examples for each of these types. So the first example of assisted population migration is what I'm showing you here is a map that was recently published in 2020 by the Eastern Seed Zone Forum. And these are new seed collection maps that they take into account plant hardiness, but they also take into account ecological mapping that's been done on the landscape, and they tried to snap them to county lines. So you're seeing this new seed zone map that was created, relatively new. And I want to give an example from the Superior National Forest of what assisted population migration might look like. So the Superior National Forest, and I'll get into a more detailed example later, is located in that northeastern corner of Minnesota, in that pink seed collection zone there. One species they commonly plant right now is white pine. And the old way of doing business would be to collect white pine cones on the forest in that pink zone and then plant that seed onto the landscape. If you're thinking about assisted population migration, and this is where the animation comes in, Maddie, what you would do is you would collect seeds from one seed zone south. So if you're in Minnesota, you're familiar maybe with some of the counties there, they might go to Carleton County, somewhere in that brown area, collect white pine there, and then plant it onto the Superior. So again, assisted population, it's a low risk type of assisted migration. You're taking seed. It's the same species on the landscape that you're planting, but you're taking seed from further south, hoping that it's more adapted to future climates. The next type of assisted migration, and as we go through these, you increase your risk factor a little bit, is assisted range expansion. And this is where it's the human assisted movement of seed sources or populations from their current range, where they're located now, to areas that are just beyond that range. So what you're trying to do is facilitate or mimic something that could happen naturally over time, but plants can't move. The climate is changing more rapidly than they can keep pace. And so this is a way to maybe mimic something that would naturally happen over time. And an important distinction to make here between this and the next strategy is there's no natural migration barrier here, but this is something that could likely happen over time, given enough time. And so I can show you an example, again, to the Superior National Forest. So swamp white oak is a species that has been studied. Brian Palick is a researcher with the Forest Service, and he's been looking at good potential substitution species in the event of an emerald ash borer infestation. So replacing ash on the landscape, what might be a good species to plant? And in some of his research trials, he found that swamp white oak was performing well as a potential replacement species. And so this species is becoming of interest to people in northern Minnesota. If you want to add the animation here, Maddy, swamp white oak does not currently grow in northeastern Minnesota. Its range currently ends where that purplish blue band is in Minnesota, so around the Twin Cities metro area. And so an example of assisted range expansion would be taking swamp white oak and planting it in northern Minnesota, perhaps as a replacement to ash species. And so it's near the end of its northern range, but it is not yet in northern Minnesota. It's something that could happen over time. There's no natural migration barrier there, but this is an example of maybe fast tracking that movement northward. And then the last type of assisted migration that I want to discuss, and this type is the riskiest type. And unfortunately, when you mention the words assisted migration, this is often where people's minds jump to immediately, is this type, is assisted species migration. And this is where you're taking seed sources or populations to a location outside the established range of that species, but beyond a location that's accessible by natural dispersal. And so again, that distinction between this one and the last one, and the reason you're increasing the risk, is there is some kind of natural migration barrier that the plant would normally never be able to overcome, no matter how much time it was given. And you're deciding to move that species into this new location. And final example here, again, for the Superior National Forest. Again, I want to cite some research by Brian Palick, doing some climate change research, looking at potential species, replacement species for red pine, should they not persist on the landscape, because red pine is another dominant species in northern Minnesota. And in his climate change research trials, again, this is just a research trial, he planted ponderosa pine to see how that might work as a replacement species. And if you want to add the animation, thank you, Maddy. Ponderosa pine is not native to Minnesota. It's native to the Rocky Mountains and to the Black Hills in South Dakota. But there is a natural migration barrier there. There's the Great Plains are blocking the movement of this species over to Minnesota. And so planting ponderosa pine is an example of assisted species migration, that long distance movement of species. And again, unfortunately, this is what people tend to think of automatically when we talk about assisted migration, but it's the riskiest type and is not the type generally that the Forest Service anyway is not promoting using this type of assisted migration on the landscape. And we'll get into that later in the presentation. But now I'm going to hand it over to Maddy for a brief bit.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie. We have a lot of different links and resources to share with you today. And Katie, I was thinking that we might want to share those Eastern Seed Zone guidelines as well, if you have the link for that. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and share some more key resources for helping make decisions around assisted migration and kind of, finesse these, the kind of differences between the different types of assisted migration that Katie just provided an overview of. So the first thing we want to share is this climate change tree atlas. So this has been developed by U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station scientists, with particularly the Landscape Change Research Group. And so what this tool is it lets you explore current tree species, traits, and suitable habitats in the eastern U.S. for 125 different tree species and examine how they are likely to be affected by a changing climate. So we're, with this tool, using three different global climate change models under different emission scenarios, so a low emissions future and high emissions futures, and then seeing how suitable habitat across the landscape is likely to shift for these different tree species. So information and data through the atlases provided for individual tree species. You can see here the landing page. You've got a couple different featured trees there. So I'll walk you through that. Then there's also regional summaries that are provided. And so ultimately, this tool can be used for a lot of different ends to assess the vulnerability of current tree species, help identify future adapted species for projects, and understand natural colonization likelihood and infill potential for certain areas. And so this really is a web-based tool that includes three main components that you see here. So the atlas brings together information about habitat suitability that's powered by a distribution model, migration potential, and then lastly, a suite of tree species traits based on an extensive literature review. And those are going to include both biological characteristics of those trees as well as their responses to different disturbance factors. So altogether, these are really the three core components that are powering the Climate Change Tree Atlas. So like I mentioned, you can use the atlas a couple of different ways. And one of those is to examine results for individual tree species. So we wanted to just show an example here with black spruce. There are a lot of different map outputs you can pull up, but some of the key ones you can pull up for an individual species are the habitat under current conditions. So you can see the current distribution of black spruce on the left there. And then on the right, you have projected future suitable habitat. And this is under a high emission scenario using the average of those three global climate change models. So you can get really nitty gritty and look at it under different individual climate change models, but we'll often kind of default to looking at the average of those three different models. And so, yeah, you can see the difference, between the left and the right image here. You can see the darker green range and importance values in the legend there shrinking into those more northern areas. And then for each individual species, you can also look at an overview of climate change adaptability. So this is another feature of the website. And so again, this is giving the species kind of an overall adaptability rating based on those biological and disturbance response characteristics. So for black spruce here, you can see some of the main drivers reducing its adaptability are those different disturbance factors, including fire, top kill, pests, and drought. And so you can, on the Tree Atlas website, there are also tutorial videos. So this is, we want to introduce this to you, but if you're not familiar with this tool and you really want to learn more of the features, the tutorial videos on the homepage are really useful for like breaking down each of these features. So another way to interact with the atlas is to look at a variety of different regional summary tables. So for this, you just scroll down a bit on that landing page below those featured tree species, and you'll see links to different regional summary tables. So you can access results for states, different watersheds, ecological regions, NCA region, National Climate Assessment regions, as well as national forests, national parks, and urban areas as well. So those are really, really helpful. This is an example of one of those regional summary tables. This one is for the Superior National Forests. So you can see now, instead of looking at an individual tree species, here we're looking at a table of results for many different tree species that are present in different abundances on the Superior National Forest. So it's a little bit overwhelming at first, but I would say focusing on the colors is really helpful. And there is, again, like a key that breaks down each of these columns on the Tree Atlas website. But just to kind of show here, we have black spruce. You can see, I wonder if I have like a little laser pointer capability on here. Well, basically, you can see if you go over kind of to the middle of the table, under that adapt and capability columns, you can see medium adaptability and fair capability of adapting to climate change for Black spruce, and overall a large decline projected. So you have the column that's labeled change 45 and change climate 85. So those are low emissions and high emissions scenarios respectively. And there's a large decline projected for Black spruce. Whereas if you contrast with northern red oak, you can see large increases in those two columns there. So yeah, really, really helpful to pull up your region and look at some of these summary tables. And if those colors kind of make your head spin a little bit, another thing we've done at NIACS is to actually summarize that tree atlas, those tree atlas outputs into PDF versions of these results as well. So this is an example for northern Minnesota, and it's just another way of using some iconography to display the tree atlas results for this region. So you can find those summary PDFs for different ecoregions across the North Woods and New England and Central Hardwoods on our forestadaptation.org website. Okay, and to connect the dots here, we wanted to also introduce a tool that hopefully you'll all find very useful for exploring the links between those vegetation responses that are being explored in the tree atlas and connecting that to bird habitat and distribution. So the same team that developed the climate change tree atlas, the landscape change research group, also developed this climate change bird atlas. And so, yeah, we know that climate change, you're probably all quite familiar with some of the ways that climate change is impacting birds. We have shifts in migratory arrival, mismatches in timing of resource availability, advances in nesting dates, and yeah, other kinds of impacts on bird species. But the kind of point of the bird atlas here is also exploring that bird distribution is not constrained solely by climate conditions, and that future tree species patterns, as they're altered by climate change, are likely to also have independent influences on bird species distributions because of the ways that birds' behavior and distributional patterns are linked to vegetation and land cover characteristics. So with this tool, so with this tool, the group looked at the distributions of 39 different key tree species to predict bird distributions for, I believe, 147 different bird species. So this is looking at changes in just 39 focal tree species and how those kind of map to these bird species. And so version 2 of this tool is online. There's currently a third version in development. And these habitat projections are based on version 3 of the tree atlas. Katie and I both definitely geek out more on the tree atlas. We're kind of newbies with the bird atlas, but you can always get in touch with members of that landscape change research group to kind of do a deeper dive in the bird atlas. But I did want to show some of the summary change maps from this tool. So it's, it is an older version, but it produces results that look very similar to the tree atlas outputs. And so here you have some summary change maps for Baltimore Oriole. So again, with current modeled habitat on the left, and then you have an average of those 3 global climate change models under low emission scenario in the center and a high emission scenario on the right. So again, the blue, the darker blue, is a greater concentration of suitable habitat for Baltimore Oriole, and you can see that shifting northward under the different climate change scenarios. Okay, I think this is where I'm going to pass it back to Katie to talk some more about the Superior National Forest Assisted Migration Plan.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Maddie. So, um, we talked about assisted migration definitions, and trying to present you some tools that you can use. And one of the reasons I want to focus on the Superior National Forest Assisted Migration Plan is because it's the first plan written by a national forest in the country within the Forest Service agency, and it's also one of the first plans in the nation. So the state of Vermont has a assisted migration plan. I know the Wiki group in Wisconsin is trying to develop some assisted migration guidance, but even though this topic is of broad interest, there are actually few resources or examples of how people are planning for it. Canada's a little bit ahead of us if you want to look into resources in Canada, but I wanted to present this as a case study because the plan is available and I think it has some useful resources to help you all make decisions about assisted migration. So Superior National Forest, you can see on the map here, is located in northeastern Minnesota. It's within the 1854 ceded territory of the Grand Portage, Bois Forte, and Fond du Lac bands of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. And I got annoying animation. Sorry, Maddie. The animation here. One reason that assisted migration that they developed this plan is because they are located at the southern edge of the boreal forest. So the boreal forest is dipping down from Canada, and they're right at that transition zone where the southern range limits of boreal species are meeting. They're meeting their southern limits. And so another animation, Maddie. Right now, it's home to boreal tree species and some Arctic relics, things like jack pine, black spruce, paper birch, species like Canada lynx and moose. And so there's some urgency for that forest to create this plan because the species are meeting their southern range limits and the impacts of climate change are more pronounced at those range limits. So next slide. Just brief information about how the plan was developed. The process began in 2020. At the time, I was working on the Superior National Forest, so led the development of the plan. It took about 3 years to develop, and these are lists of all the people who were involved. So there were over 20 organizations involved, which was in over 100 individual people involved. So really, the Forest Service was throwing so many resources at it because, as I mentioned, it's the first one within the agency, and it's one of the first ones in the nation. So it's been really well researched, and I think it can provide some really relevant information to folks. It took about 3 years to write the plan. Next slide, Maddie. And there's a link here. I think Maddie can drop one in the chat too, but the plan is now published online. It was just published last fall. It's about a 100-page document. You see it on the left. And there's a implementation guide that goes along with it. That's about 25 pages that is not published on the web because they anticipate updating it kind of pretty frequently. But if you reach out to me or anyone on the Superior, they can share that with you. I got an animation here. I wanted to mention that something that was really important was tribal engagement. There was heavy tribal engagement around developing an assisted migration approach for the forest. And the end result was at the outset of the plan, the Superior, I think they were anticipating using more aggressive tactics, so maybe more range expansion or species migration, those tactics that I mentioned earlier. But after tribal engagement, what we learned was that species assemblages on the landscape, current species assemblages hold a lot of cultural value, and that the preferred approach by the tribal bands was not to do aggressive assisted migration tactics. And so the end result of the plan is assisted population migration is the main approach they plan on using, and that is just planting the same species, taking them from further south, taking the seed from further south and planting them on the forest. So they plan to convert their whole reforestation program, which is about 1 million seedlings annually, is about what they plant, to assisted population migration stock by the year 2050. And if they decide to use range expansion or species migration, that they will formally consult with tribes and get approval from the regional geneticist. So that's the overall tactic that the forest is taking. And I just want to link you, if you want to advance the slide, I want to link you to some of the resources that I think if you go into this plan and look at it, that could be really useful for you if you're trying to make decisions about assisted migration. So the folks on the Superior, they had 16 tree species, main species of interest, and those species were species that are currently being planted on the forest, and then some that they thought they might be interested in planting in the future, like swamp white oak, hemlock doesn't occur on the Superior, thinking maybe if they're going to do some range expansion, they had just some interest in this. And so we had a team of geneticists develop genetic profiles for each of those tree species of interest. And I imagine, just from the folks who are attending this, who are in the network, likely if you're thinking of a tree species, it likely has a genetic profile in the plan. And one of the really important things that came out of that work from the geneticists is you see on the table, this is a summary of all the things they analyzed, but one of the things was a maximum transfer distance. And this is really helpful to understand if you want to do some assisted population migration, how far south should you go to collect the seed? And I'm showing you the jack pine table here. And what it says, it says to go to 70 to 140 miles south to collect your seed. So that can give you a rough idea about how far south you should travel to collect seed if you're considering doing assisted population migration. So I think that's a really useful resource. The next slide, Maddie, shows another example of how you might determine how far south to go to collect seed. So there is a tool known as the Seedlot selection tool that we can also provide a link to. And this map is in the plan. And this tool was used to help the Superior visualize where they might be collecting seed. And what the Seedlot selection tool does is you tell it where your planting site is, and then you can put in these different parameters. Yep, here's a visualization of the tool. And what I was showing you is the outputs from the tool for the Superior. So this is, you can choose a planting site and then put in different parameters, and it'll tell you a future climate match for your planting site. So if you want to go to the next slide, Maddie, I know you're busy putting links in the chat too, but this is showing an output for an area near Duluth that if my planting site is Duluth and I want to match a future projected climate, and you can specify emission scenarios, but there are default modes in this tool that make it easier to use. Those dark orange locations on the landscape are where they're suggesting would be a good climate match for you to collect your seed if your planting site is in the Duluth area. And so, nuance between what those species profiles I showed you before, those were specific to individual species. The Seedlot collection tool is not taking into account individual species, and their genetic traits or anything. It's just looking at climate data. So it's saying in your area, a good climate match for future climate is going to be in this orange zone. And then, sorry, this was a different example, that it's important to recognize, if any of you are working in the Great Lakes area, that there is a lake effect that we have. So if you saw that last image of the Duluth and how it's really saying, go further south. Now, if you go advance to this one, I put a point that was closer to the shore, and it's really saying you should be don't go in southern Minnesota, go to, the Bayfield Peninsula in Wisconsin or into the UP. So there is a lake effect that you should be aware of if you're working in the Great Lakes and using this tool. That's important to consider. And then the next thing that I've already mentioned as a resource for helping is this new Eastern Seed Zone form map. And actually, it's hard to distinguish here, but that the North Shore of Minnesota is its own seed zone. It's a different color. I wish it was more vibrant. It's this like tan color that doesn't stand out, but it's its own seed zone. And if you just want to follow a general rule of thumb to go one seed zone south, this is a good map to use to help you understand what a seed zone, these new ecologically updated seed zones in our area look like. So just trying to give you, general guidance on where it's a good idea to collect seed, because, white pine, when we talk about getting seed from further south for a species, white pine's range is huge. I mean, it goes all the way almost down to Florida, and you don't want to go collecting seed for white pine that far south. So this is just some good guidance on how far south to go if you want to do some population migration. Next, I just want to talk a bit about risks associated with assisted migration. Again, this is all hoping to help manage risk and help you make some decisions if you're interested in doing it. So there are risks associated with assisted migration. So one thing that we neglect to talk about oftentimes is the risk of doing nothing. The climate is changing and it's changing rapidly. And so there is a big risk associated with continuing to plow on with business as usual and not consider climate change impacts. That's what, these two past webinars have been about. There's a risk associated with doing nothing. And that goes with assisted migration as well. There's also, with assisted migration, there's risks to the target population. So the tree species, if you choose to do assisted migration, say you choose to get a species from further south or even seed from further south, there's a risk it may not be able to, if you move it too far north, it may not be able to tolerate the deep cold winters or the spring frosts that more local populations have been adapted to. So that gets to that point of not going too far south with your seed. There's risks to non-target populations. So species in the ecosystem, there are risks to introducing new species in particular, or new genotypes. And this speaks to that species migration, that riskier tactic. If you're taking something from very far away that may not naturally have been able to migrate there, there's always the risk for potential negative consequences or invasiveness. And that's why that strategy in particular is more risky than the others. And then there are socioeconomic risks, like we learned on the Superior development of the Superior's National Forest Plan, that there's a lot of cultural value in some of the species on the landscape. And so altering those species, communities, and compositions holds risk to the cultural significance on the landscape. So what is your risk tolerance with assisted migration? And this is hopefully, I want to present this spectrum here and then talk you through how you might go about making a decision on your land. So it's all about what kind of risk you want to take. The bigger area you're planting, like the Superior planting 1 million acres, you probably want to take fewer risks. If you're just a private landowner and you're just planting a couple trees in your yard, you might be able to do a more risky maneuver than a national forest could. So lowest level of risk is planting species that are currently abundant, they're common on the landscape, and you continue to plant those species and you get seed from one seed zone south. Moving up a little bit in risk is, and we didn't really talk about this previously, but when Maddy was showing those tree atlas summaries, they were saying how common some species were on the landscape, and some of them were rare, and we don't mean like endangered or threatened, but just they're not very common. Maybe they're at the northern end of their range, but they might be adapted or predicted based on tree atlas results to do well with climate change. And so something you may consider doing is increasing the abundance of those rare species that are climate adapted by planting more of them on the landscape. That's something that is relatively low risk, trying to promote more of those species that are at the edge of their range limit. Another increasing risk a little bit more is to plant species that are currently absent from your area, but they're found within close proximity. That would be an example of that range expansion, moving things further north, fast tracking their dispersal northward. And then finally the riskiest one is planting species that are currently absent from the landscape and distant from their current range. That's that species migration option, taking something from very far away. So these are different options available to you, and it's all about your risk tolerance. And so next slide is, I just presented this to a different group of landowners, but if you want to make an informed decision about assisted migration on your property, this is kind of what I might do if I was going to do it, and the resources that are available to you. So first, I would look at those tree atlas summaries that Maddy presented. They're available by ecological section, national forest, watershed. I put ecological section here because that makes sense to my mind, but whatever kind of regional summary makes sense to you, whatever scale you're looking at, look at that summary, look at one of those tables that Maddy showed you where you're planting and determine which species are abundant, common, or rare. After you've done that, next slide, Maddy. So for the abundant species, abundant and common ones that are already there, you might consider planting them, but getting your seed source from one seed zone south. You can look at that Eastern Seed Zone Forum map. You could use the Seedlot selection tool and find a climate analog area and collect the seed there. Or if it's one of the 16 species that the Superior was interested in, you could look up its species profile and the distance that is recommended and go that far south to collect the seed. So that's how you might employ assisted population migration on your property. Next slide. If a species is currently rare, so maybe it's at the northern edge of its limit, but it's present on the landscape, it's not super abundant, you might consider planting more of them on the landscape if they have good capability to cope with climate change. And so this is, or infill potential, this is a term that the Tree Atlas folks use to talk about the potential of that species to move northward. And so I've highlighted a chunk of them here that show what I'm trying to demonstrate. If they're rare on the landscape, but they probably will do well with climate change. They have good capability to cope with climate change, and they're likely to move northward. Those might be good species to plant more of on the landscape. One caveat that I want to point out here is you can see that one of the species in that box I've got up is green ash. And we all know that emerald ash borer is coming through and wiping out all the ash on the landscape. And so anytime you're using any of this Tree Atlas information, it's really important that you're considering your local knowledge of the landscape, of the threats that you have, also of your planting site. Like, you don't, just because it says it's a good species, and maybe it's an upland species, but you're trying to plant a lowland, you don't want to put that species there if it doesn't make sense for the site. So just a word of caution to always use your local lens and expertise when you're thinking about this. But anyway, another thing you might consider is planting more rare species that are climate adapted. And then the final slide, Maddy, is if you're interested in planting a species that's absent from your area, again, use tools like the Tree Atlas to determine how far your site is from that species range edge and determine the level of risk you're comfortable with. So I just wanted to show like 3 different species with range edge maps that are on the Tree Atlas. If think about, like, look at northern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin and eastern red cedar, its range is pretty close. Like, that might be a species you might consider moving northward. If you look at black oak, I don't know, if I was in Minnesota, I might be more hesitant. If I was in northern Minnesota, maybe in Wisconsin, that might make sense. And then if you look at live oak, I mean, to me, that's like, no way, I'm not gonna plant that species. I'm not gonna try that. So there are a lot of tools. If you feel like you're on that riskier end of this edge of the spectrum, you can take some risks and you want to introduce a new species. This is a simple gut check you can do, is looking at the range maps of where they're currently located and where their range edge is, how far north it goes. I'll hand it back to you, Maddy.
Thanks, Katie. I did want to, while we still have these steps up, just read out Christopher's question in the chat. So he says, you mentioned that there is a risk of no action, but the risk spectrum is just risk of action. How do you balance risk tolerance when thinking about level of risk from no action?
Yeah, I mean, this is a conversation, Chris, and feel free to join in because I know you're doing some assisted migration work too. That is just associated with climate adaptation in general, and particularly with assisted migration. And this is where I guess I've been trying to have conversations with people to at least be open to the idea of assisted population migration Again, alarm bells tend to go off with assisted migration because people think about that risky option that does have, the potential for invasive, potentially introducing invasive species, potentially introducing disease. But there are ways to do assisted migration responsibly. And just, I think the threat of having maladapted species on the landscape that are going to be more prone to insects, more prone to disease, more prone to drought stress or the climate stressors at hand is a large risk. And maybe that particular topic is not given enough conversation in these types of presentations that we're giving, because I think it's a really good point that should be highlighted more and not maybe just mentioned as a side note. And I don't know if you want to, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, Chris, but if you want to speak to anything of your experience, feel free.
It is a really interesting question, because perhaps it's a little bit more of a mystery. It's a little more difficult to think about risk of no action, because there's just so many ways that could look in terms of climate impacts and overall climate vulnerability of different ecosystems in the landscape. Whereas, we think about the risk of a target population, like Katie was saying, we can kind of discreetly imagine, like, okay, well, maybe these plantings don't take because they all get hit by a spring frost, right? Like it's a little easier to discreetly give examples of those kinds of bins of risk versus kind of this big scary world of risk from no action. What could that look like? So I do think it's a really interesting thing to explore. So we have about 15 minutes left, and we wanted to make sure we shared some examples, but also we want to make sure we have a little bit of time for questions. So I'm going to just cruise through some of these. Hopefully the kind of steps we took to break down the overview of assisted migration options today, as well as kind of having some informed decision-making steps, was helpful for you all. I think even as long-time users of the Tree Atlas, audiences that we have who have been using some of these tools for a while, it's still really helpful to think through how to make informed decisions. So hopefully that's been helpful to you all. One of the real-world examples we wanted to share here is from the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Network, or ASC. And so this second college grant site in New Hampshire is one of 5 original ASC network sites. The network has grown quite a bit over the years now. But essentially, the goal of this project, the ASC network, is to test different silvicultural approaches to climate change adaptation, to really serve as examples and areas of inquiry across the US and Canada. And so you can see here we have an overview of transition goals and approaches taken at this second college grant site. This project also has resistance goals and approaches, as well as resilience goals and approaches. So for each of these ASC project areas, a team of land managers and scientists are coming together to develop different treatments for resistance, resilience, and transition. So really thinking about that toolbox of climate adaptation options. But of course, since we're here talking about assisted migration, just wanted to highlight some of the details from their transition approach here. So you can see their various strategies and approaches. So they're doing variable density thinning, and you can see kind of the size of the gaps there, and the retention in the reserves. And then they're increasing their future adaptive offsite species, including the species that you see listed here. So here's a few more details on that. So they planted 6,500 bare root seedlings at this site, only in those gaps that were created within their transition plots. And so this is the table of species that they were planting in those gaps, as well as the Tree Atlas results for that. And so we have some initial results unpublished on seedling survival from these plots. And so you can see the different species listed here. And then also on the left, the FAM is standing for Forest Assisted Migration Type. And so you can see which species were population expansions and which species were those range expansion plantings. And so there was overall, slightly lower survival for seedlings representing those assisted range expansion versus population expansion plantings. And so, yeah, one point they have here is that lagged response may pose a potential risk to planting today based on those 100-year projections. So again, it's that kind of that balance of maybe at what point or maybe at what year in this century do some of those 100-year projections for the species kind of start to click. And in addition to seedling survival and growth, the team is also monitoring songbird, small mammals, insects, and fungi, and other wildlife community responses. So this is just some initial data on bird response from the second college grant site in New Hampshire. And yeah, really, these are some very recent results that were presented. So, if you're interested in diving deeper into this, we could put you in touch with the folks at that site. But you can see there was a little bit more, animations here. So on the left, we have results for control and resistance associated species, and on the right, the transition plot associated species. So you can see on the x-axis, you have CN for control, RT for resistance, RL for resilience, and TN for transition. So you can see the kind of shift in different bird species associated with those transition plots. So I thought that would be interesting to share with you all. And then lastly, we just wanted to share as well this assisted migration being integrated into an ash replacement experiment. So this is a large-scale management experiment in Minnesota that is including different silvicultural approaches for establishing replacement species in black ash forests. So again, this is led by Brian Palick. And some of the results from this so far are indicating promising survival and growth of at least some of the replacement species. In an 8-year study, they found that survival is highest for American elm and swamp white oak, followed by hackberry and maple. And so the hackberry and the swamp white oak are both species that are range expansion species. So they have their northern range limit within about 150 to 200 kilometers south of this study area. So that link goes to a more detailed slide deck on that experiment if you're interested. And with that, I think we'll just thank you all for listening today and open the floor up to any questions.
Thanks, Katie and Maddie. This is a great presentation. I love the bird surveys from the ASCC project that you shared. Is that like 4 sites that they're like doing bird surveying? And do you know how many years that's going on?
It was across the treatments.
Mhm.
I'm not sure how many sites total there are for that for the second grant area. And I don't know how many years it's been going on. Sorry.
Okay.
This is like
That's
just
okay.
slides we got from a recent presentation of theirs.
Yeah, sounds good. I'll look it up. It must be on their website. Anyone else have questions?
Hi, it's Mike Fitzgibbon. A little bit off topic, but generally on climate change and tree species replacement. I was wondering why there are no conifers in the black ash replacement species. I guess it's probably a soils issue, but species like tamarack and black spruce can take quite a bit of water, and so would it just boil down to the soils aren't right?
Tamarack and other conifers are definitely included in that study. I was just highlighting, again, for the sake of like drawing the connection with our assisted migration conversations. I was just highlighting some of the results on survival for those species.
Yeah,
But yeah, if you look closer at that study, those species are included.
yeah, they probably would not be very good for ecosystem function to as a replacement. And also, is there any difference in when you use the term historical versus natural range of variability? I hear that both used often, and I'm not sure exactly what's implied.
Could you clarify, I
Well,
guess what the his
yeah, in this discussion, you're talking about historical distributions, and then also sometimes here natural range of variability used. Are those? I don't think they're synonymous. I think there's a difference, but I'm not sure which.
Yeah, I think, well, I can attempt to answer that. Historical is when I think in the context that I might have been using in the presentation today is referring to the range of where that species has been found in its distribution. And natural range of variability often refers to not a tree species range, but the ecosystems on the landscape. I don't know if Maddie, if you have any other clarification to offer there.
No, not really. I could see it getting like accidentally like interchanged and not being very clear. Well, yeah. The other thing I think we were using the word this is slightly different, but I did want to go back and clarify the word natural barrier. Katie was kind of discussing with range expansion and population, or sorry, with range expansion and species migration, this idea of like not having a historical or natural barrier. And I think that's a really interesting one to pick apart because again, we were thinking about like ponderosa pine, right, and the Great Plains, right, like that historically, ecologically is going to be an impediment for range expansion or migration of certain species. But thinking about like range expansion, for instance, down in Michigan, in northern lower Michigan, there are plenty of like non-natural barriers that we can think about in relation to these range expansion conversations. So we have a huge agricultural belt and many highways built across the middle of the state. And so even for some of these species that might have really great infill potential, right? So maybe species we've already seen start to migrate north a little bit. There are these now artificial barriers in our landscape. So not exactly answering your question, Michael, but it did bring up another thought for me. A different Michael has a question.
Yeah, this is kind of a comment that I was hoping for you to react to, and you kind of did it within the presentation. So we have some species of, well, particularly trees that are pretty obviously going to be moving north. And so things like, white spruce and balsam from where I'm at, where I'm at in Wisconsin, there's going to be a northward movement of these through time. And they are also incredibly important species for a collection of birds that utilize them. And I've had a hard time wrapping my brain around how to feel about it because on the one hand, they're going to be less successful further south. On the other hand, they provide a pretty significant resource for birds, particularly things like white-winged crossbills in winter, but then things like other species like, bay-breasted, Cape May, blackbirdian warblers, stuff like that. And I kind of feel like it might be worth fighting to keep those species, even though there's going to be a natural tendency for those to go north. And I was hoping for you to react to that, because this has been one of those things that, I've had a hard time wrapping my brain around, frankly.
I mean, I think there's good justification there, Michael, and it's similar what the Superior heard from tribal bands. It's like, don't abandon species just because they're projected to decrease on the landscape. I mean, a real move you can make right now is, if you want to maintain them on the landscape, to get the seed from further south, using those guidelines we introduced, so that the ones that you retain on the landscape are better adapted to the climate. And as the climate continues to warm, maybe you continue to go further south if you can. At some point, these boreal species in particular, their range edge doesn't go far enough south that you could collect any seed. But the thing that we have to pay attention to on the landscape as managers is, when those species are starting to decline at mass rates, and we don't think we can maintain them on the landscape any longer, even by getting seed from further south, that may trigger us to take more risks and to consider planting more rare species, or even introducing a species that might provide that same ecosystem function, thinking of birds in particular. If it can be replaced, I don't know. But I don't think you have to abandon the current species on the landscape right now, but we can be making choices to help them be more resilient.
Yeah, and I would add to, Michael, I'm not sure if you were able to make our previous presentation, but it was recorded. But we shared some more tools that are kind of across that adaptation spectrum of resistance, resilience, and transition. So we have our forestry adaptation menu and our wildlife adaptation menu that we shared in a previous presentation. And there are definitely some more tactics and approaches related to that in those resources. So like establishing refugia that we know are going to be really important for maintaining those species. So we do definitely explore that and provide some kind of options in some of our other resources. Looks like Jamie just put the YouTube link for that in the chat too.
Yep. Thanks, Mike. Both Mikes, thanks for your comments and questions. And Maddie and Katie, thank you so much today for giving this presentation. And I wish we had more time, but we are at 11 o'clock, so I'd like to respect everybody's time and move on with our days. But I will share your contact information so that people can send you other comments or thoughts they had from today. And I just really, again, appreciate you providing 2 presentations for our Northern Forest Bird Network and tying in those bird aspects as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for
Awesome.
having us.
Yeah, thank you
Yeah.
all.
Have a great day.
Take care.
In August, we'll have another one on Camp Ripley with Josh. They're going to talk about red-headed woodpeckers, so I'll send emails about that. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Thank you.